Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast for today. That's a little bit of pre-work for our class on genetics and genomics. We're going to go from a baseline to a little bit back to microbiology in this podcast. I'm Dr. Lori Westbury, your professor for the course, and in the right lower corner, you can see my professor avatar. So here we go. I call this the Genetics in Healthcare Boot Camp, Wrestling with Genetics and Genomics with Westbury. I always like to start with a thought of the day, and today's thought is, nothing in life is to be feared, it's only to be understood, and that's Marie Curie. This too, genome sequencing is not to be feared, okay? This is an exciting game-changing technology that's transforming healthcare. You're going to hear that comment several times during this whole course, right? We're talking about technology advancements. We're talking about AI that's aiding in clinical decision-making, right? We're talking too about how to use this safely and ethically. And we're going to go into a lot of that, both in this podcast and further when we proceed into some of our activities in the course. Patients are presenting to healthcare specialties and benefiting from the power of the genome. We're going to talk a lot about personalized medicine, personalized healthcare, personalized medication. Those are all words that are sometimes used universally, but they're very different aspects, right? So again, personalized healthcare is the term that I prefer because that means everybody in the healthcare team has a part in this, which is very true. Whereas personalized medicine, we think more of MD derivative or provider care. And again, we are all providers and we are all equal partners in genetics and genomics and utilizing some of the knowledge that we have from the power of genetics. Personalized medications are really changing, right? That's a real big aspect of what's going on. Drug labels are changing to include gene mutation information. We'll talk further about that, but those that maybe would not do well, if you have a specific gene mutation, maybe you won't do so well in a particular using a particular med. Maybe you synthesize things a little bit differently, medications, etc. And these alerts are coming in our electronic medical administration record too, so in our EHR, about interfaces with genes, genetic incompatibilities, etc. We already talked about, and by the way, you'll hear me say G and G a lot of times for the sake of simplicity, but that is genetics and genomics, and I'll tell you the difference in just a minute. But we have a lot of gaps to bridge. Our consumers are sometimes coming to us with more knowledge than what we have in genetics and genomics, and that's a problem, right? We have different communication strategies too. That we need to, different language, so to say, when we're addressing risk perceptive behaviors in practice, when we're discussing terminology in genetics and genomics. I'm going to give you an example now that is the last bullet point on here. Many times we hear individuals talk about, I have the BRCA gene for breast cancer, whether it's BRCA1, BRCA2, both. Technically, we all have copies of that gene. Okay, but do we carry a mutated gene? Okay, do we have a mutation upon one of those genes? That's where the language differences in the communication really need to be started from. And we're going to talk about a lot of that today, and we're going to go back to microbiology and have a little boot camp on that too. But that is where we have to have different communication strategies. In class, you're going to have a different communication level of discussing some of the questions that a particular patient might have regarding their genetic composition after they get genetic testing. Again, In nursing, we're responsible for interpreting some of these, all of these things that are coming towards us by our patients, just like we do in everything else with answering questions. So on the screen, I have sort of the difference between genetics and genomics. I won't read this verbatim. It's on the screen. You will also have a separate copy of this PowerPoint as well without the podcast. But I just want you to understand that genetics is to the right, genomics is to the left. Genetics, for simplicity speaking, is the study of the function and composition of single genes. Genomics is sort of the complete genetic information of an organism, and it's sort of that whole coding, right? And the non-coding of the DNA. So genomics is sort of that big umbrella, and the genetics is a little bit more of that single gene. Again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in just a second. So we'll go back into history quite a few times within here, but I'm going to really look more at nursing practice within this podcast. So again, there was in 2003, there was the Human Genome Project, which was the expansion of new knowledge and evidence that has the potential to impact nursing practice. Huge project, different elements within that, many projects since then too. I'm just going to highlight a few in this podcast. But where do we come in as a nursing practice? Well, the ANA in 2002 also had a position statement, okay, that leaders in nursing integrate genetic knowledge and skills at all levels of professional practice. And we sort of had the emergence and rapid developments have happened, and they really wanted to personalize nursing. And I'm not going to read this verbatim to you, but what does that mean to us? Well, we know that there's gaps. You all are getting a lot of genomics and genetics information within the technology course. What's happened in the past? You might have had a little bit of a sprinkling of genetics and genomics. Maybe you had some in OB and PEDS. Maybe it's been several years. Maybe you didn't have that. Maybe you've been in you've been in nursing for a very long time, and maybe coming back to school now, and now you're coming back to that. Yes, did you have it in your pre-nursing prerequisites, so to say? Yeah, you had a lot in microbiology, but it wasn't nursing specific. And we know that the answer is no to that. And there's been so many advancements now. But again, since 2002, there's been a call to put this into nursing education so that the transition to healthcare practice was that much better. But that hasn't happened, right? Or it's happening at very different levels, right? So we need to have this education to maximize technologies and knowledge that are going to benefit patient outcomes, right? And so again, leadership in this, how do we really bridge this gap of implementation of this science to the application to our clients towards better outcomes? So I've put a lot of facts on here, from definitions to consumer engagement. And we know that consumer engagement is so very important, right? And there's safeties that go with that, right? And what I really want to focus as you're reading this slide here as I'm speaking is really that this is an era of personalized medicine. Again, you know that I like personalized healthcare. But I really want to focus in on the bullet point that says personalized genomic information can help change treatment from interventional to preventative. We know that's a huge focus, right? That we're trying to focus more on preventative, sort of minimize readmissions, whether it's clinical cases or it's using genetics for this preventative basis as people, more and more of our clients are getting genetic testing, right? So what can we do? And so this is what we're going to focus on within this course and within our podcast today. So you all have heard a lot about the AACN essentials. You've worked upon those in school. You've heard a lot about that. But what I really want to talk about on this slide is that in our old essentials, okay, whether it's 2008, 2009 in the domains, and now we're in the 2021 domains, there's a little bit of a difference. So in the old essentials, genetics and genomics was referred to briefly in patient-centered care, right? And now it's still in patient-centered care, but it also has its own domain within informatics, sort of as the umbrella. Naturally, we saw fit at EU to put it in under this technology and informatics course that we have, really as an umbrella of knowledge. And again, you're going to have this in other courses as well, but this is to really solidify some of this basic knowledge in this course. And I did put sort of the responsibilities that are on there as the ANA has seen in the essentials of genetic and genomic nursing. And this goes with what I just said as well. In other words, there's some essentials of genomic nursing that the ANA has come out with. I will show you some of those competencies within this podcast as well, and we'll talk about that. We cannot omit the ANA Code of Ethics as well. Okay. Yes, we've talked about the essentials and where that lays in, but I really want to talk to you about the Code of Ethics throughout this podcast as well, because it really is a huge part within genetics and genomics as well. We've talked to that we've had a sprinkling of this information, but collectively we have to be prepared. We have educated consumers coming to us for guidance and assistance, but do we know how to answer their questions? In just a bit, we're going to talk about genomics in a little bit more of, remember that microbiology background? We're going to talk a little bit more of kind of that proper terminology and what exactly happens. But something that I really want to bring up is that we cannot forget that there's genetics, but there's also environmental and modifiable factors such as diet, exercise, pollutants that can impact further risk for these diseases or conditions or mutations that occur via environment. So again, we cannot forget that there are other things. I also want to really talk about the nurse's ability to take an accurate family history and recognize risks and opportunities, right? As we do these pedigrees, and our EHRs assist with this now. But when we have genetic testing involved too, and we can interpret different gene variants maybe that come up on genetic testing, are we accurately incorporating this on our family history and nursing history? Okay, yes, providers do this as well, but we know that we catch things sometimes that are maybe not on H&Ps or history taking or pedigrees of any point. So we need to understand this a little bit more as well. So with that topic, clinical decision-making, workflow, health information technology. That's what I labeled this at. And taking a family history, again, we said, there's a pedigree down there, and our EHRs really do this based on the things that we input, right? Or the provider inputs. And we'll talk a little bit more of what makes a really good pedigree and how many generations to go back. But I really want you to understand too that this is, we're assisting and we're allowing our patients to have this information, right? Where do they pass this information on to? What is the inheritance pattern? And we'll talk a little bit back about Punnett squares and dominant versus recessive in just a little bit as well. So I would be really not being transparent if I said that we have had quite a bit of time with addressing let me rephrase this. We've had bias in the way that we work with pedigrees, right? How we put certain diagrams to traditional male and female. And we're going to do an exercise in class or as part of your module with use of symbols and modern times. And I say modern times because, again, we have non-binary genders. We have transgender, associations. So what do we do and how do we make a proper pedigree that does not involve bias? And again, I'm going to hold that until we do our class activity. But this is really important. And I want you thinking later when we do this activity, have our EHRs caught up with this? In other words, do they have traditional symbol use, or are we putting this nomenclature into our EHRs? So again, just something to think about. I won't take a lot of time, but I also want you thinking too, when we're taking a history, are we using non-judgmental questions? And I want you to think about that because I think a lot of times in our EHRs might be a basic history taking sort of template, right? Are we incorporating these things? Are we using non-judgmental questions? Take a look at these. See if you're using that. Are we still talking husband and wife instead of saying spouse or significant other? Are we talking about, are we using things like, are you married? Are you living with anyone? What is our terminology? So think about that. So I talked about personalized healthcare, personalized medicine, personalized medical care. This is another thing, kind of equating terminology, precision health. I want you to think about that for a minute. Yes, I put a definition down there about tailored patient care based on an individual's genomic or other omics, you'll hear omics, right? Clinical, physiological, lifestyle, behavioral, and environmental characteristics. I personally really like this definition because it incorporates sort of everything, not just genomics, but yes, including genomics and genetics. Precision health. What does that make you think, saying precision health? Kind of exact, maybe? Precise? So think about what that means to you and where we're going with that terminology. So these are two elements we're going to talk more as we further go on after we do a little bit of background and boot camp, so to say. But many people are volunteering to get their genomic material, their genetic testing sequenced so we can learn more about health and disease. Okay? There's risks with that, right? And we'll talk more about that as we go along. I'm in a project that the All of Me project, which you can Google that and you can become a part of as well. But I decided to do that to find out a little bit more about my background, but also to help others. But again, that comes with risks, right? Because we're not really sure where all this information is. And if the information can either be obtained by other parties or security breaches. And this course is talking a lot about that, whether it's cybersecurity in organizations or it's material and data being extruded from cyber criminals or by other third parties, right? And so again, this course will talk more about that, but again, you can volunteer to be part of something like this. Pharmacogenetics we're going to talk more about too, and we started to talk about that, right? Those specifics that maybe we can effectively see mutations that maybe somebody won't respond to particular medications, or we can minimize side effects by basing genetic code to particular medication. So again, we're going to talk more about that. I am not here to give information of, what's a good genetic testing site? What's the best? No, I'm not here. I just wanted to list a few of them down there. And you can see Genos, Veritas, 23andMe. There's Ancestry, right? But that is not really healthcare related. It's more where you're from and more of your background, so to say. But what I really want to sort of talk about is the first bullet point, which is GINA. And GINA actually was approved in 2008, but enacted in 2009. And that is the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So what that means is that it keeps, I'm going to say, I'll use health insurance first. Health insurance can ask, have you ever had genetic testing? But they cannot deny you, because of GINA, to get covered. Now we're going to talk more about that in just a little bit, okay? Because there are some loopholes in that. But I want you to know that there is an act that is a non-discrimination act that's been around since, again, 2008/2009, that can protect you. And I say can protect you because it does, but there are some loopholes that we're going to discuss. So there are limitations to GINA, as I just said, and there's social implications and bias. I've put on the slide, and this is actually with the assistance of a colleague, but I just want you to understand too that there are some acquisitions to DNA testing and loopholes in there. It has been proven that healthcare and health insurance really is protected under this, but life insurance is not. Because that's a voluntary type of thing, and you can't go under GINA. So life insurance can ask you, have you ever had genetic testing? And if you say yes, they can deny you, based on maybe an assumption that it's going to, that they're going to have a bigger payout on some things in life insurance, okay? Again, that's voluntary, right? Also, there's a lot in the media, and I put like social issues. We'll come back to that in a minute, but there's a lot of articles saying genetic testing can hurt your chances of getting some types of insurance. Again, at the present time, I will say that most of the time it's life insurance and things like that, but can this change? And will GINA have to have further amendments to this act? And I think we understand that probably there has to be a little bit further. Something that was created in 2008, 2009 does have to have updates. And we know that in basically a lot of our federal acts in healthcare and politics, etc. There's a lot of social issues too, okay? And I put, for anybody familiar with the TLC show 90 Day Fiancé, there's a particular character or a person on that has Tourette's syndrome. And we know that sometimes there's a stigma with some of our genetic conditions, right? And maybe it's misinterpreted, right? Maybe we say, oh, that one looks like she's drug addicted, or, behaving badly, or, drunk, something like that. So we also know that the perceptions too. This particular couple was thinking about having kids, and they had some issues about what's going to happen in future generations. So again, we see these social issues on TV, we see it in film, and we're talking about that in a minute. But what kind of privacy do we have, and what about when we do disclose things? So these are things to think about. There's no perfect answer to this yet, because we know that we are addressing things as they appear. We'll further talk about this in class and in some of the literature you'll read too. But again, are we reimbursed for testing? Where can testing happen? Testing can happen in a hospital. It can be referred to from your provider. There might be coverage. We'll talk a little bit further about that. There might be third-party sharing. You might be sharing your results with your provider as you did a direct-to-consumer testing. Those would be those 23andMe, Veritas, et cetera, that I showed you. Those testings have decreased in cost. They can be from $100 to a couple $100 now. Hospital testing, if you're not reimbursed, or even if your insurance covers, can be a little bit more expensive, and can be a little bit more detailed too, and that can be up to a couple $1,000s. And we already talked about life insurance denials, or asking that question if you've ever had genetic testing. I encourage you to, if you want to know more about GINA, and I put some things, and we might even do an activity in class, but you can find that there are GINA violations. And I just wanted you to know that if that interests you, you can look at that. And yes, as I said, we have a lot of genetics and genomics in movies. I've listed some of them there. It can be genetics and genomics, ethical dilemmas, maybe towards genetics and genomics, healthcare realities, and access and injustice. It says access and justice, but we might term that injustice. And there's just a list of some of those. Even The Simpsons did a little bit of a GMO episode with the, by the way, GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and it was titled The Man Who Grew Too Much, and so you can even Google any of these. You're going to hear the terms ELSI or FELSI, okay? I've put a sort of a diagram of a FELSI, and that would be financial, ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics and genomics, okay? And this one has Turner syndrome, just a little, quip about that. Sometimes financial isn't looking at, we don't look at that. We only look at the ethical, legal, social aspects of that. But I do want you to understand that there is a financial, okay? And on this one, I put who pays for lifelong care. And that's something to think about. That is not universal, and that is not without injustice and biases in certain circumstances as well. But I just wanted you to understand what this terminology means when you hear it. We've already talked a little bit about the Human Genome Project. We've talked about GINA. There's more information on there, but I also really wanted you to be highlighted into the ANA Code of Ethics that really addresses genomics and the application of genomics in nursing practice. And they really bring up that ELSI aspect, okay? And again, I gave you a little bit more information about that. When you hear about genetics and genomics, a lot of times we really sort of focus in on tumor profiling and biomarkers. And so those definitions are on there too. Again, there's so much more than that. But in those two aspects too, we might have had some experience when it is about certain forms of chemo, maybe that targets certain therapies for a particular cancer or tumor, right? I also do want you thinking, as we just talked about FELSI, I want you thinking financially too, because sometimes we really see that there's certain therapy and chemotherapy that is specific to that type of tumor or that type of cancer, but we have insurances that deny paying for that, even though it says it's the best for the better prognosis and outcomes. As nurses, as healthcare in general, practitioners, where does that put us when we know that there's something better and more specific to that particular gene, but it's not going to be reimbursed? And patients are at the framework of, what do we do? What can we afford? And do we risk potential using something else because it's covered when it might not have the same prognosis? And that is a real ethical dilemma that we're in. And so I've listed here just some categories, right? Categories of genetics and genomics study, and we've talked about some of this already, right? And again, I hope I've accentuated the ethical decision making that we and our patients are in. Again, not knowing necessarily what the right answers are to all this, but how do we navigate it? How do we guide our clients? And how do we also have some resilience in what we do, in how we have to deal with these things as well, and how we're guiding, but do we always have optimal outcomes as we're guiding? So because this podcast is going to be a little bit lengthy, I want you to stop for a minute. I want you to reflect for a minute, and I want you to just look at these questions, right? Have you had a patient with Down syndrome? Have you ever passed meds now that have a pharmacogenetic warning on them? Have you already cared for a patient that's been referred with genetic testing? Do they need some information? Yes, we're going to do some activities in this course, but maybe you've already had some of this experience. So I want you to reflect, and I want you to gather your thoughts at this point. So a colleague of mine we're in a grant together, and they sort of put together like some of our hot go-to G&G topics, right? And so I'll let you look at those. We know that there's, as we hear of, designer children, right? Using genetics and manipulating genetics towards these kind of designer babies, and how we have GMOs for foods, right? We're kind of manipulating organisms in foods, and we already talked about direct-to-consumer testing being at a high right now. How are we using stem cells and gene-based therapies? So just something to sort of look at, and these are our hot go-to topics right now. So we've talked a little bit about bias in the pedigree, right? And how we put genders, beyond male, female, etc. Let's talk a little bit too about disparity in general in genomics and health equity, right? So sequencing still remains an expensive clinical tool. I said that some of the, testing now is a couple $100, which some might think it is much less than it was, but that's still prohibiting, right? Or maybe the therapies that are associated with particular genes are extremely costly, and that's still true, very costly, right? So these expenses are exacerbating what's already inequities in our healthcare system, right? So are we also widening now by the scarcity of genomic data generated from people of diverse ancestries, diverse races? And the answer is yes, right? So we are maybe having genetic data from a particular section of the population without having it very diverse. Yes, these volunteering into, like I said, the All of Me and some of these genetic bases, again, you are volunteering your genetic material for free, but is that diverse? So again, we don't know. And again, for those that are paying to get testing and things like that, it might be from strictly, some populations without diversity. So the next several slides are really what the ANA, and updated in 2023, is really looking for indicators for nursing assessment and integrating genomic knowledge mostly into, again, the essentials and into competencies in education. So obviously we're doing a lot of these within our course, but it's how do we put it into practice? And I won't go through all of these verbatim now because hopefully the activities that we're incorporating into this course are going to put all of these into here, or that knowledge, that general broad knowledge. And then you will take that into your practices. Again, a lot of it is a basic understanding. It's collecting a family history. It's doing your physical assessment. So it's things you do already as nurses, things we do or will do as nurses. But how do we really incorporate more of the genetics and the genomics aspect? And so again, these several slides here really put these competencies into sort of bullet points and put a little bit of a framework for you in there. So we're 30 minutes into our podcast, and I know the rule of thumb is podcasts should only be about 20 minutes, right? But I wanted you to have some of these basics. We'll go through some very basic, we might speed it up, and then we're going to take it back to nursing and where we're going, okay? So let's let the review of the microbiology and G&G bootcamp begin. So we talked about the Human Genome Project, right? And the first sequencing of human DNA, and I gave some information there. We're also going to talk about actual definitions, right? And what is it? And genetics is the study of traits and conditions that are encoded in block sequences in the molecule of DNA. I'm going to show you a few little maps and diagrams that are going to help. But again, what does it really give you? What does your DNA give you? Your ancestry. You might find some siblings or relatives that you didn't know. There's a lot of things that are within there, okay? And we talked a lot more about variants, risks for cancers, and then we talked about pharmacogenetics as well. So, again, we always bring everything back to movies and things like that, right? How are we related? How is heredity a concern when it comes between generations and transmission of traits? And so again, that's what it's all about. I want to talk a little bit too about what makes a cell different from another, and you really see what these terms are. You saw this a lot in microbiology. This is just to kind of clear out the cobwebs, right? And we've got the genome, we've got the chromosome, the DNA chain, and genes within that. Again, more vocabulary. We have about 20,000 to 30,000 genes, right? And again, we'll talk more about some of these things as we move along. The human genome contains about 3 billion base pairs or nucleotides. Again, just a feedback back to our microbiology. Again, more structure pictures. and to show you that each nucleotide base pair has the GCAT within it, right? The guanine, the cytosine, the adenine, and the thymine aspects. And I think you'll remember that. And I've broken it down a little bit more, components of phosphate, sugar, and base. And here they are of how they kind of bind together, right? The chemical structure gives two key abilities essential for being the basis of life. It can replicate itself when the cell divides, and it holds information, right? And again, a little bit more information, right? Of what exactly the DNA, the RNA, the protein, and the cells and tissue, right? It's a recipe book, right? I have a little information here, and later when you get the PowerPoint, you can play this little TikTok kind of thing here too that really talks about replication, transcription, the gene expression then and the translation. So that is just another feedback as well. And it may start when I click this.
This is arguably one of the most important aspects of biology that you should know. It's called the central dogma of molecular biology. A dogma is like a set of principles, and like in this case, that all of molecular biology follows. There are 3 steps to the central dogma of molecular biology. In order they go replication, transcription, translation. Replication is when DNA copies itself, shown here in our illustration. Transcription occurs when DNA copies itself into mRNA. Translation occurs when this mRNA sequence is translated into a protein. Both replication and transcription are going to occur in the nucleus because they involve our DNA. Translation, however, occurs at the ribosome because that's where we produce our proteins.
So there's a little review for you on that. So if you're an X-Men and all those kind of things fan, you will really, there's a lot about mutations, right? Within comic books, within the movies. And so a change in a gene is a mutation, and it can have an effect at the whole person level. Alleles are the variants of genes. So they can be inherited or arise by mutations. Again, there's a lot of information there. Mutations in sperm or egg cells are passed on to the next generation. And remember, these can be positive, negative, or neutral. And that's the important things. Mutations have a connotation that they're always negative, but that is not so. So we've already talked, and again, going back to some movies, we've already talked about mutations that can be DNA or they can be environmental, right? And again, you can see the mutant turtles there. You can see environment, right, through insects. And then you see from the movie Wonder, the craniofacial newborn condition that the particular character had. So you can see that, what one chromosome, sort of the different aspects of that. And I won't go through that. I'll let you look at that. But again, it shows you sort of the characteristics of the chromosome. So again, just to give a little bit of information, it shows you that, a little bit more about tissue cells, how many cells we have in our body, and that tissues are groups of cells that share a function. Again, we look and say that every cell in our body has the same DNA, okay? And then there's the karyotype, and we'll talk a little bit more about karyotypes and autosomes and sex chromosomes in just a second. So, your karyotype is the individual's complete set of chromosomes. Having said that, we have 23 pairs, right? And 22 are autosomes, and the 23rd pair are sex chromosomes. And again, there's a diagram of that. This is a picture too from I've created a Jeopardy game to kind of test yourself. And we probably won't have time to do it in class, but I've given you that source that you will be able to do that. But it'll kind of quiz you on some of the things that we're talking about now. From this Jeopardy game is also another thing. I put a question in there that says, this percentage of DNA sequence is estimated to be unique in individuals. And as you can see, technically, we are 99.9% identical. We have a possibly 0.1 to 0.5% of differences. And I think when you look at that, it's sort of, it kind of shocks us, right? In genetics and genomics, we will say that Mendel is sort of our discovery of traits, right? And what are traits? And again, I gave you that information here. We also remember doing Punnett squares, right? Making these dominant and recessive abilities in our family history. What is considered dominant? What is considered recessive? We've talked about pedigrees already too, and genotypes and phenotypes. There's definitions there. And how do we sort of look at the likelihood that someone will have a certain condition or a certain genotype or phenotype? Along with that, I pose a question here. If one parent is heterozygous for brown eyes and the other parent is homozygous for blue eyes, what's the chance they will have a brown-eyed child? And if you would do the Punnett square, similar to what's up here, you would come up with a 50% chance. And those definitions of homozygous and heterozygous are on there too, just for your recognition of traits. So I have some basic, bigger picture comments down here. And again, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but feel free to look at this. And there's some things that, we look at evolutionary relationships with DNA. You can see that, humans share more than 98% of genetics with chimpanzees. We also really start to look a little bit more about sequences between and among individuals by DNA profiling. We've talked a little bit more about this in the past. We look at how we use DNA in forensics in natural disasters to identify victims. We look at analyzing food to determine authenticity of things and gourmet items and items like that. We can also say DNA analysis is also sort of like a time machine. We've heard a lot about using that on, as we said, forensics, criminal analysis. They've done analysis of DNA in, tombs of mummies, and you can see King Tut. We've looked at DNA and Thomas Jefferson and children, and fathering children and things like that. So again, it is sort of a time machine as we look back to that. Okay, so let's go back to our role in healthcare genomics. We went on a little bit of a boot camp back to microbiology and definitions of things. And so let's talk a little bit about biobanks. Biobanks, right? That's where all of this information of samples is stored. And we talked about diversity and how we need more information from all populations, not just select populations, to make decisions. We've talked a little bit about genetic modification. We talked a little bit about GMOs, whether it's food, in drugs. We've talked about editing, and perhaps those editing in sort of those, selective sex of babies or these designer babies. We've also, you're going to hear perhaps about the CRISPR-Cas9. That's actually an enzyme that uses a guide to guide RNA to identify and cut out and target certain DNA sequences. Now, it sounds like it could be useful in some things, and then there's some ethical situations and some other editing, right? And by the way, the CRISPR, it actually, what that terminology means is clustered, regularly introspected or introspaced, short palindromic repeats. Now you know why we call it CRISPR. So sequencing, exome sequencing. What I really want to talk about this is it's valuable in identifying extremely rare diseases swiftly. Notice how we put the word swiftly. It used to be years to really look at these gene variants, really get down to specifics, identify rare diseases and potentialities. Now it can be a matter of hours. And I think that's a powerful statement when we look at that. Again, we all have different feelings of what's happening maybe with genomics and genetics, but for some rare diseases or those diseases that have maybe a prognosis that is very time elemented, it could be children's conditions, etc. I think that this is extremely powerful, that it can be done now in a matter of hours. So we've talked a lot about maybe some biases, some inequities. We've talked about different social issues. We've talked about equal access to genetic testing and treatments. Again, we've talked about financial aspects. We've talked about a little bit, and we'll talk more as we talk about security of data, but misuse of genetic information, maybe some, GINA violations. But also, I also like to add in that there is potential abuse of genetics to cause harm. What I mean by that too, and you're going to hear me refer to this in a lot of things with technology, and genetics and genomics are no different, the abuse of genetics to cause harm. Okay? I want you to think about that. Abuse of genetics to cause harm. And I want you to think of intent versus impact. Okay? Our intent in a lot of things, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in the science behind healthcare, our intent may be different than the impact. We use that a lot in biases, in when we're trying to stress DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, right? We say the impact is very different sometimes than where the intent started, right? And I want you to think of those terms, and I want you to think of things that can cause harm in some of this high advanced technology or sequencing of genetics and genomics. I placed some global perspectives on the screen here. So again, we have a lot of instances, right, that we can share new diagnostic testings and therapeutics, right? The individual nations are adopting guidelines. Where can we share this information to suit strengths that we may have from one country to another? Bioethics, right? We really talked about a lot about privacy. Where can we share this information globally? How can we be global entities on these acts, federal acts that might be coming out, and global aspects of this? Things to think about, because we're not exactly there, right? So we briefly discussed pharmacogenetics, and I want you to know that there's technically two different terms, just like genetics and genomics. The same thing here with pharmacogenetics and pharmacogenomics. You can see, following the definitions of genetics and genomics, again, the pharmaco part of it is exactly the same. The pharmacogenetics is individual genes influencing a drug response, and the pharmacogenomics is the effects of multiple genes to responses. So again, it follows those definitions. Some further information that I want to bring about that is that, again, this personalized or precision health can really use a genetic, an individual's genetic profile to guide decisions made in regard to the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of a disease. It can also look at avoiding drugs that may not work well because, or cause serious adverse effects and events. In other words, are there certain gene variants that encode for these enzymes? Are you an ultra-rapid metabolizer or a poor metabolizer of a particular med? Think about this. We said that testing is becoming a little bit more affordable and insurance coverage is expanding. Again, we know we're not there totally, and there are some diversity issues on this. But let's talk about the savings, the financial savings, if we find out that certain medications might not work for somebody, so why prescribe them, right? And the cost of then, individuals getting better sooner because they have appropriate meds. Things to think about, and financially too, and insurance-wise, that could be a pleaser to the insurance companies. So I put on the screen some of the meds that have already been classified and used in precision med and the pharmacogenetic portion of this, right? And I put a little thing down there that the FDA recommends now genetic testing for all people with colon cancer before starting certain meds. And patients with ALL, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, they want genetic testing before chemotherapy meds are actually started. And you can also see there's other conditions that this has already been, there's been some, trial and recommendations in pharmacogenetics. We've talked about some of these things already, but I also wanted you to know that in the data from 2023 of insurance claims shows that most of the uses of pharmacogenetics or genomics were in cases for pain, chronic pain, cardiac, mental health, and they still term it as psychiatry cases. I have a problem with that, but that's my own personal bias. Having said that too, that Medicare covers some testing based on this criteria above, and Medicaid in some states covers testing based on that. Currently, the data shows that labeling for 456 prescription drugs sold in the U.S. Includes some kind of pharmacogenetics prescription information. So that's something to think about too. Actually, if you ask me, that number was actually for the data now. I thought that was actually higher than what I anticipated. But when you see that it's most usage in pain, cardiac, mental health, and also in chemotherapy agents too. We're going to talk more in class about nanotechnology, not necessarily all related to genetics and genomics, but there are things in nanotechnology, certain kind of tattoos almost that have certain medications on them. There's some swallowable pills that concentrate directly, whether it's a PET scan kind of thing or it's delivery of cancer treatment that affects certain cells. There's all kinds of nanotechnology too that are being used in conjunction with genomics and particular tumor profiling. So within this discussion too, and what's going to happen more in class, we talk a lot about the electronic health record, and I just wanted you to know that there is an NIH-funded sort of study that goes on right now with electronic medical records and the genomic network. It's called the eMERGE-3. It's researchers within it might not be funded by the NIH, but it is an act that's funded by the NIH, but it's how to communicate genetic information to the patient and team. It's how to really put an understanding of genetic changes and how they affect health and how to communicate this with more to a team, to the healthcare team. We're starting to put that now in education, as you see, but again, we know that there's gaps in the transition into practice or existing practitioners, right? So again, we're also finding out, you might hear the term cascade testing. And that's when individuals share their genetic results with family members when they're at risk because of a certain variant that's been found. Do they share that, and do we offer testing to those that may be affected as well? We hear a lot of this in breast cancer, colon cancer, etc. But cascade testing, we're finding out, is usually provided and covered by insurance. We want to really stretch that out a little bit too. I know I mentioned it under the movies and books and things like that, but if you've not heard about the HeLa cells and the story of Henrietta Lacks and cervical cancer cells, I really strongly suggest that. That's misuse and ethical dilemmas within research using genetics. And to recap the whole story would be very lengthy, but I highly suggest, if you don't know that story, to really either read that book or even do a simple Google search about the basis behind that. Because again, that really brought about a lot of ethical and really sort of public service announcement of things that happen in research sometimes that are unethical. Something that I want to bring into fruition in this slide is just to say that we already talked about genetic testing can be done at both the healthcare setting or it can be done direct to consumer, right? Having said that, there is data and research that says participants who receive the results from a genetics provider, meaning more in an organizational level, more frequently share the results with relatives than those that do the direct-to-consumer or non-genetics provider. Okay, I want you to think about that because there might be an element of keeping things a little bit more private or not have the guidance, right? The guidance of what do I do with these results? What does this mean? I don't understand this. Whereas a provider or a healthcare practitioner might explain a little bit more, counsel, the patient. And you, again, in one of these activities, you're going to have a chance to kind of do that a little bit more in an activity that we're going to do. I've started to stress that we do have background, right, for the importance of competencies, right, at all levels of nursing in genetics and genomics, okay? I'm in a grant project right now that is really focusing on DMP and graduate level, but the ANA really stresses at all levels of education at the academic level so that the transition into practice is ever so much better, because this is currency in our healthcare settings, right? And that's all settings. That's not just the hospital setting. There's a lot of resources. We might not be aware of these resources, right? If we don't have the background. You have a lot of EHR, clinical decision support systems, right? That might be referring to certain things. You might get drug alerts with the pharmacogenetics. You might have different ways that the EHR is harnessing these genetics and genomics. But do we understand? Do we understand what our next point really is? This is an introduction, and we're going to get so much further into this, but this is your introduction to get you thinking. What have you seen? If you're in practice already, if you're not in practice, what do you expect? Where is that basic knowledge? There's a lot of resources. I've gave you some of them, but I've listed them on here and their websites too. Again, you're going to have a copy of this PowerPoint where you can just click on the links as well. Here's some things I want you to think about in conclusion, right? There are thoughts right now that APNs, right, as providers, should do all the genetic counseling. Mandatory, right? But are we there for the education, right? We say that all nurses should understand and be able to counsel based on genetic testing. But are we there at every level? Now, I just want to give you a little background. There are genetic counselors, right, that work with providers and teams. They can do the ordering of genetic testing that it might be specific. Let me rephrase that. They work with the providers for the specific genetic testing. I want to give you some background. They're usually biology undergrads. They're master prepared degrees in genetics. They're a crucial partner in the integrating of genomics in healthcare and personalized medicine or healthcare. They're educated specialists. They work with the team. They work with us, be it APNs, be it advanced practice, advanced degree nurses, undergrad nurses, providers. There's a short supply of genetic counseling programs. Right now, there's 30 in the US and Canada. They're in high demand. Some patients' wait time for this personalized medicine counseling or personalized healthcare counseling, once a mutation of a gene is detected, is 12 to 18 months. Now I want you to think about that. Is that providing improved outcomes? If you're waiting 12 to 18 months to really find out what do I do or what does this mean that I have this mutation? Do all our providers have, is there a gap there? Are they providing all of this information? Are we, as nurses, understanding a little bit more and can provide some guidance, right? Now, we know we do not diagnose, right, unless we are advanced practice, APNs, but do we do we interpret and help the guidance of where we go next or where the patient goes next with this information? Okay? Some areas and organizations are implementing mandatory newborn screening and gene sequencing in efforts to improve health outcomes for our newborns. Have you seen this? Does this add to healthcare inequities based on our zip code, so to say? What about parent literacy? If newborn gene sequencing is being mandatory, and I don't know, can we make these things mandatory, right? When we think about ethics, legalities, GINA, can we make that? Should there be areas, environmental areas maybe, that are making this mandatory for newborns? I don't know. How do you feel about this? But what about parent literacy, anxiety, concerns, implications? As nurses, if we're working in organizations or in states or areas that are making this mandatory, do we know? Did we know about GINA? Do we know how to guide our parents and literacy? Literacy in healthcare is huge, right? Literacy about everything. But do we have the literacy in order to guide others? That's something to think about, right? Is the interprofessional team of provider, counselor, and RN, as all levels, like I just said, is it necessary for genomic and genetics information? Right? Yeah. Do we have to really incorporate an interprofessional team and the knowledge throughout that team? And do we stop there? What about lab? What about IT professionals in that too? As things start to get in our electronic health record, or accessing that from, intraoperability, right? We're learning about that in this course, about transferring that, all health records. Does that get transferred as well? For consistency and for better quality improvement outcomes. So again, where does that interprofessional team, who's in that interprofessional team? Things to think about. I lastly really want you to reflect on how genetics will profoundly change our roles and our responsibility in healthcare. How will this genetic and genomic data change how we provide care, right? Obviously, I have my little emoji up there saying, hey, do you have any questions? But I want you to think about them, because this is just the prelude into some of our activities for this module. But I want you to think of your questions and think of your concerns, because there are questions and concerns, right? I also talked about having Foundations of Genetics and Genomics, a Jeopardy game. Feel free to click on that link. You do not have to play with the team. You can really look at that to give you, again, some basic information. I tried to cover that in this podcast, but you may want to test your knowledge a little bit further. Thank you for spending your time. I can't wait to delve into this topic a little bit more in our class activities, but I hope in some ways it brings about a lot of reflection points for you. I hope you're excited of the future. I hope you're concerned about the future. And I hope you really are engaged in the future of increasing your literacy and those of your patient and your family to help quality improvement outcomes. Thank you.